very pleased to introduce today a very special guest, Professor Howard Newby, who is the Vice Chancellor of the University of Liverpool. As you have seen from the announcement, Sir Newby is someone who has an outstanding experience in higher education as well as achievements both as a scholar, as a teacher, as a university administrator, as a policy maker. He has been a professor, a vice chancellor of several universities in the UK, currently University of England, and before that University of the West of England in Bristol. He was a chief executive of Higher Education Founding Council for England, vice chancellor of the University of Southampton, chairman and chief executive of the Economic and Social Research Council, president of Universities UK. I don't think that there are many people with a more impressive curriculum vitae in higher education in the UK, so thank you very much for coming, Howard. But this is part actually of the higher education research group at CEU, which consists mainly of master and PhD students who have an interest in higher education, and we organize throughout the year a series of events, and we are also starting some specific projects, research project, policy project. I think what is perhaps interesting at CEU, our approach is a little bit, higher education as not being something separate from the larger policy field, and students who specialize in higher education policy actually study in a Master of Arts in Public Policy. We don't have a degree in higher education alone at CEU, but I also welcome other colleagues from CEU, some of whom are actually doing a PhD degree in higher education in the UK, and I would like to welcome our former provost, who has been at the University of Liverpool for I don't know.
1974 till 2000.
For many years. So Professor Newby will talk about higher education in a globalized world, and I'm sure there will be time for questions and discussions at the end. So once again, thank you very much for coming.
Lily, thank you very much indeed. I'm going to probably do this more like a seminar, although you're seated in rows. I do want to encourage some discussion. So. If you don't mind, probably I'll do it sitting down so you can increase the informality rather than sort of harangue you. And I want to really consider three things in this presentation. The first is I want to say make some general comments about the impact of globalization on higher education worldwide. And these comments are largely based on my involvement in an OECD study that began about 5 or 6 years ago and finished about 2 years ago, which looked at 26 different countries and compared the trends in higher education in each of those countries. And I was involved, I headed the OECD review team looking at Japan, and I was a member of the team which looked at China. But what was interesting, whether you're talking about China or Japan or Hungary or the United Kingdom, there are some quite clear similarities in the trends in what is going on. So that's the first section. In the second section, I want to say something about the role of the state and its relationship to universities and how that has changed over the last 20 years or so. And then thirdly, I think I would not be fulfilling expectations in coming here if I did not say something about what is going on in England at the present time, where there are some quite radical changes taking place in the funding of higher education. I'm sure you know this, especially if some of you are doing PhDs in the UK. And I won't say too much in detail, because actually the details still remain unclear, but that may help promote some discussion afterwards. Now, I will try and leave some time for discussion and questions. So, let me begin. Globalization. Well, I could, of course, give an entire lecture on globalization. Indeed, entire books have been written on globalization. And I don't want to spend a lot of time defining what I mean by globalization. There are lots and lots and lots of definitions. What I mean really is simply the free flow of capital and labour without hindrance from national boundaries. It's a very simple definition, but for my purpose it will be sufficient. And in the first part of my presentation I want to say a little bit about what that means, or what that has meant for higher education worldwide, and especially in Europe. Now, of course, ironically, if we go back far enough in history, we can see there is nothing really new about this. In medieval Europe, the growth of universities was certainly recognized as part of one of the responses, one of the transnational responses to the needs of emerging medieval institutions, especially the Roman Catholic Church. And of course the University of Bologna, the first university arguably in Europe, was founded on that basis, as indeed were other universities shortly afterwards. But I think it's fair to say that from the 19th century onwards, we saw two things. First of all, the rise of the nation state, which of course is very much characteristic of the 19th and then the 20th century, and alongside the rise of the nation state, the growth of universities as recognizable institutions delivering learning and teaching to what then was really a very elite section of the population, of course. So although we need to remember that in a previous historical period, organising university education across national boundaries was not particularly new. Nevertheless, in the last 10 or 15 years, it seems new, because really the growth of modern higher education has been sponsored by and organised through the nation state. But of course, the modern impact of globalization has also been coupled with increasing competition. So the particular form of globalization that we have seen in the wider economy has involved the widening market for knowledge, ideas, services, as well as goods. And universities everywhere have been part of that, and universities everywhere have come to be placed in increasing competition with each other, not only within nation states, but more importantly these days, between nation states. That's most obviously true in the case of research, where the competition has been global for arguably 20 or 25 years. It's increasingly true in the case of learning and teaching. And that is because students, especially the most talented students, are increasingly internationally mobile. That's particularly true of postgraduate students, and I certainly, sitting here, don't need to remind you of that. It's also increasingly true of undergraduate students, where the most talented often demand, and I think quite rightly, an international experience as part of their undergraduate learning, in a way which simply was not the case even 10, 20 years ago. And there are good reasons for that, we should remind ourselves. I'm not going to say a lot about this now, but the world which our generation of students are graduating into, as opposed to my generation, is one which by definition is multinational, multicultural and multi-ethnic. And we do need to educate our students to feel comfortable with that world, to participate in that world, to feel a sense of global citizenship and not just local or national citizenship. And they need especially to feel comfortable in dealing with what these days I think we would call cross-cultural communication. I have to say, as a native English speaker, it is not just that everybody, in inverted commas, these days speaks English. That's the problem. The problem for us is, what do people mean when they speak English? And this issue of cross-cultural communication is really a very serious one, I think, for us as educators when it comes to talking to our students. Now, just one brief illustration of this. This slide is about 2 years old, so some of the people have changed. But here are the chief executives of a number of the most famous multinational corporations in the world. And I'm not going to go through them. You can see for yourself that the CEO of Sony is English. In fact, he's just retired in the last few weeks, or announced his retirement. The chief executive of Renault is Brazilian. The chief executive of Pearson, is a British educational company, and publishing company is American, and so on and so forth. Now, this simply goes to show that when you're operating with the most talented students, who have quite rightly ambitions and aspirations to aim for this kind of future employment, they do need to be made familiar with a multicultural, multi-ethnic and multinational world, a world in which they feel comfortable, in which they can flourish, and they will quite rightly demand an education which, in a way, trains them for that future. Okay, that's not a major point I want to make, but I think this is worth making. So, globalization has brought increasing competition, it's brought a global circulation and mobilization of top talent. There's another sense in which globalization has impacted on universities worldwide, and that's on the research side, that many of the major challenges which we all face as global citizens, and which universities have, I believe, a responsibility and a duty to address, are also global. Issues about sustainability, environmental sustainability, issues about food security, about public health, about global security. All of these sorts of issues require a concerted global effort across disciplines and across nations to solve them. And no one discipline, no one university, and certainly no one country can address these adequately on their own. So also in research, we see one impact of globalization is the growth of international collaboration between nation states to solve some of the world's most pressing problems. And so one of the interesting issues we face when one looks at higher education is how this global, national, and local and regional levels of both research and teaching are integrated together. And that's a challenge, I think, still for a lot of nation states. Now, within that context, I probably don't need to remind you, but I will anyway, that higher education is a key driver of the modern globalized knowledge economy. And it's a key driver in two senses. First of all, higher education, universities for the most part, produce the knowledge, not on their own, but they are a major producer of the knowledge which drives the new 21st century knowledge economy. But secondly, they are also the producers of the skills, of the human resources, which allow that knowledge, that new knowledge, to be used for economic and social development. So there's a double whammy here. Higher education and universities both produce the knowledge and produce the skills, our students, our graduates, who can use that knowledge. And together, that means that we are major drivers of the knowledge economy. And that means that whilst on the one hand we are driving, if you like, this new globalized knowledge economy, on the other hand, of course, we are affected by it, by the kinds of competition and market forces in this new global world, which impact upon us as well. And reconciling those two forces is not easy. It's not easy. It's ironic that the very forces which have brought about the new globalized knowledge economy are at the same time those which are increasing competition between universities themselves, and which are increasingly influencing the ways in which universities are organized and the way in which they deliver to a wide range of stakeholders in the wider society. Now, I think this is fairly obvious to you, so I don't want to go to it in too much detail, but it is really important. And it's not just that we are any longer, as universities, responsible just for teaching and research. We are much more multifaceted faceted than that, and I'm going to come back to this later on. We are not only interested, we not only deliver teaching and learning, we deliver knowledge exchange and you know, the third mission of universities in terms of innovation in our economies. We deliver social integration and by extending higher education to a wider section of the population, we deliver local and regional economic development, but directly and indirectly, as well as participating in this global economy, because all the universities are located somewhere and we have important local civic responsibilities. And lastly, this is something I could almost give a separate lecture on, we should remember that universities, and I think this will resonate here in Hungary, universities are important, and I would argue increasingly important, institutions in civil society. That is, as institutions which stand between the state and the individual and mediate those relationships. And at least in Western Europe, there are not many others left because of the secularization of society. It means that the churches do not play such a large role as they did in the past. There are other institutions of civil society which have been weakened actually by the forces of globalization. But universities endure. Universities endure. So governments come and go, states come and go, rectors and vice-chancellors come and go, but universities endure, and they have actually become more important, I would argue, as institutions in civil society, whilst these forces of globalization have been taking place. When one looks at the role of, therefore, the modern university, the 21st century university, one is struck by really quite important contrast with that of certainly the 19th and also the 20th century university. And let me just explain this in a rather oversimplified way, but I think again will be relevant here in Hungary. In Europe, although not quite so much in the UK, but certainly in Europe, and to some extent the United States, the development of the 19th century university was very much influenced by the Humboldt model, the model of the Humboldt University in Prussia at the beginning of the 19th century, in which you may recall, and the importance of that model, the Humboldt model, the Germanic model of university, was twofold. First of all, to introduce the notion of research as, or at least the creation of knowledge, as a vital role for universities. We were not just teaching institutions, we were also there to create knowledge. And secondly, in creating knowledge, we had to be separated off from society. This is the notion of an ivory tower, that in order to study and to create knowledge in a rather unbiased and independent way, we had to be removed from the rather vulgar realities of everyday commercial activity and politics. And so the notion of a university was the one that was rather separate from society, a kind of academic community that was rather enclosed on itself. What's interesting about the 21st century, of course, is that model is no longer appropriate. If you believe that universities are major drivers of the modern knowledge economy, then there is no way in which universities can afford to be separated from that very society and economy which they are responsible for creating, at least in part. And therefore the notion of an ivory tower is completely outdated for a 21st century university. Instead, the key word to describe the 21st century university is one of engagement. The modern university needs to engage with the wider society and with the wider economy as part of that process of driving the modern knowledge economy. And that's created some difficulties, because in the last 20 years, governments, and I would argue virtually all governments around the world, this is not confined to Europe, have therefore come to the view that universities are so important to modern society and so important to the knowledge economy that they can't be left to themselves to determine their own futures. And so I put a sentence here which probably summarizes the position. Once upon a time, and not that long ago actually, maybe 20, 25 years ago, the role of governments was to provide for the purposes of universities, basically to give universities money. Now the role of universities is to provide for the purposes of government. And I think this is irreversible. This is irreversible. Academic colleagues of a certain generation, those who perhaps came into academia 20, 30, 40 years ago, have found it very difficult to come to terms with this change. There was a view, certainly in the UK, that the role of the government in relation to universities was simply to give the universities the money they wanted and then leave them alone. That view, I'm afraid, but that view still prevails amongst many academic colleagues, but I'm afraid it prevails nowhere at all in government, not only in the UK, but anywhere in Europe, North America, or indeed Asia these days. So, as I say there, universities have been seen to be far too important for the nation and the economy to be left to their own devices, because universities are seen to be part of the fabric of a society which, at least in part, determines the international global competitiveness of the national economy and indeed, to some extent, the cohesion of the national society. And that brings us neatly to the role of the state. Now, you have to remember that during the period I was talking about just now, when it was believed that the role of government was simply to provide money, to provide resources for universities and leave universities alone, in general, the proportion of students going to university in any age cohort was very, very small. To give you one illustration, when I went to university, it was 7%. In England now, it's 45%. And there are similar rates of expansion all over Europe and indeed all over the world. I'm sure the same is true here in Hungary. I should have checked the figures, actually. And of course, the reason for that has been that governments have bought the knowledge economy argument. They have come to accept that one element of their own country's international economic competitiveness is to invest in human resources, invest in the skills of the population, and increase the proportion of the population with high level, that is to say, graduate skills, in order to be competitive in this new global knowledge economy. So governments all over the world have wished to increase the proportion of school leavers entering into universities. And in Europe, this is not a word we use in England, and it's a word I hate, but in Europe, the term used to describe this is massification. It is essentially the move from a small elite university sector to something approximating to a mass higher education system. And of course, probably the first country to do that was the United States, although in a moment I'll try to demonstrate why the United States is not always a very good model for what we are talking about. But nevertheless, that has been the model. So, on the one hand, we've had this move towards massification. Secondly, all governments all over the world have wanted to not only increase the size and scale of the system, but they wanted to do that without compromising quality. In fact, they wanted to increase quality at the same time as they wanted to increase the student numbers going through the system. And this is the really difficult bit, governments all over the world have wanted to do both of those things, that is, increase the number of students, increase the quality of higher education, and at the same time reduce the burden of the cost of that on the taxpayer. Because there are other claims on taxation, especially in countries with aging populations, from health and welfare and defence and you name it. So, and the first time you have this move towards massification, and you see this in all OECD countries. Secondly, the desire to enhance quality at the same time. And thirdly, to reduce the fiscal burden on the state of these two changes. And you find this is a dilemma that all governments face all over the world. It doesn't matter whether you're in China, the United States, Chile, South Africa, United Kingdom, and I suspect Hungary. This is a long-running problem which crosses political boundaries and national boundaries. So how do you do that? What this creates is a kind of force field. This is the blue triangle. In different countries, higher education policy gets pulled in different directions within that triangle according to local political circumstances. So, for example, in some countries, the process of massification has not taken place as quickly as it might have done. Because of worries about the cost, and I would actually put England in that category. In some countries, massification has proceeded very quickly, and quality has actually suffered. I suppose I ought to be careful which countries I'm saying this, but actually there are some, especially Southern European countries, where you could say that about at the undergraduate level. And in some countries, the issue of reducing the fiscal burden has been addressed by allowing private provision of higher education to take up some at least of the cost of massification. And that is true of Central and Eastern Europe, it's certainly true of Asia, and of Latin America. Although therefore the political outcome changes from one country to another, this is a problem which faces all countries and has done for the last 10 years or more, and it continues to lie at the heart of debates about the future direction and especially the future financing of higher education in all of those countries, the UK included. Now, if that were not enough, as the higher education sector has grown in scale, and as governments have become more and more interested in what is going on in higher education, because it's so important to the knowledge economy, so increasing demands have been placed upon universities to be more accountable. Initially, this means accountable to governments, but increasingly these days, because of this process of engagement I described earlier, accountability also extends to other stakeholders in society, to business, to parents, to the students themselves, as well as to governments and the many, many other stakeholders. Indeed, as a Vice-Chancellor, managing our stakeholders, if that's the right way of putting it, certainly relating to our stakeholders takes up a major part of my time. Now, at one level, this can be seen as quite simple and straightforward. It's a simple auditing and monitoring exercise, and although many governments claim that they are not really putting too much of a burden on universities, I think from a university world this has been a major theme of the last 20 years. Has been the burden of auditing and monitoring that we've had to face up to. Livia and I are members of a European University Association group where we are trying to measure the autonomy of different systems in Europe, and by definition the flip side of that coin is to look at the burden of audit and monitoring. This is our revenge of league tables, by the way, so we can produce a league table of governments to show how autonomous they regard their universities. And the view in the sector, certainly, this has grown over the years. I think there's a certain inevitability about that, I have to say, for reasons I've referred to, but that's the simple one. Another version of this accountability has been to place universities, and then within universities, different academic units and even individuals, on a much stronger regime of performance management. So that, for example, a number of performance measures are being produced in systems all across Europe, and now, of course, we have league tables between different countries as well as within them. And in many countries, in some form or another, funding of universities is associated with performance against certain targets, and that's something else. It's not true in every country, but it's certainly a growing trend in Europe and increasingly these days in the United States as well. Also, accountability has meant increasing regulation, and this has been particularly important. I may come back to this if I have time, in terms of thinking of the relationship between the public and private sectors in higher education. So if one of the solutions to massification and the fiscal burden of that is to allow the private sector in, then as we know from some countries around the world, it's very important that the private sector is regulated to some extent in terms of quality, because the overwhelming trend across the world, and this is where the United States is not a very good example, the overwhelming trend across the world is that the elite universities are the public universities, and the private sector has moved in to create institutions to pick up the excess demand from students who cannot enter into the elite public sector. And the issue of regulating in terms of quality and standards the private sector has been important in many countries. So the issues of regulation, and then finally, in some countries, this has been looked at through planning. The most famous example, of course, is the University of California system in the United States, with its 3 levels of hierarchy: the University of California system, which are research-intensive universities, the California state system, offering a more vocational teaching experience for students, and then finally the community colleges, which feed into both of those. But the extent to which planning has been embraced varies a great deal from one country to another. I have to say, in the United Kingdom, higher education has never been planned. It's never been planned. This is one of the difficulties we have at the present time. It's kind of just happened. And there are actually many countries where that is true. In some countries, it's a very heavily planned system. So all I'm saying here is that the response to the accountability burden has been some combination of these 4 aspects in almost all countries. And again, this creates a force field. Where a particular national university system lies within this rectangle very much again depends upon local political circumstances, and I have to say to some extent local history as well. Not all systems end up in the same place. The interesting thing then is if you combine that with the previous one, you end up with something like this. At this point you begin to see that I have a very figurative mind. I like talking in pictures. And the triangle, the points on the triangle are outside the rectangle. That is deliberate. Because it is the fact that the points on the triangle are outside the rectangle which creates a lot of the instabilities and dynamics in higher education at the present time. You cannot deal with massification just by planning it, just by regulating it. You've got to fund it properly. You can't deal with quality enhancement just by having heavy regulation or performance measures, and so on. And so how you bring the triangle inside the rectangle, or how you bring the rectangle inside the triangle, is, at least in figurative terms, a major issue of higher education policy in virtually every country in the world. I hope this is making sense in terms of talking in pictures rather than in words. Okay. If that were not bad enough, we need to come back to a previous point I made, which is that the role of the modern 21st century university is simply not just that of teaching and research. It includes all those other things as well. So while all this has been going on, universities themselves have become far more multifaceted and far more complex institutions addressing all of these issues. So you have governments struggling to deal with the dilemmas of higher education policy, making institutions more accountable, dealing with problems of massification and quality and enhancement, whilst at the same time universities themselves, for quite other reasons, have been very dynamic institutions and have been changing their character, moving away from the Humboldt model, moving towards this model of social economic engagement. So it's not surprising in a way that countries all over Europe, I'll just deal with Europe for a moment, have been really finding it challenging to how to come to terms with all of this. Now just think for a moment about something which really is not a major theme of my presentation. Think about the Bologna process. Okay? The Bologna process, to remind ourselves, began as a voluntary activity by the universities themselves. This was not a governmental initiative. And the European Union Commission in particular had no way of getting hold of the Bologna process because under the Treaty of Maastricht, higher education is not a European Union responsibility. It's a responsibility for the member states, or in countries like Germany, for the regions, for the Länder. So the Commission was first of all faced with the problem about how it could begin to steer and guide the direction of European higher education, the European higher education space, in a situation in which it had very little power. And what it did was, frankly, and this is something I personally regret, as Livia knows, it did a deal with the European Universities Association, I think a very Faustian deal. It gave the European Universities Association money, and in return got control over the Bologna process. So it went very quickly from 3 countries to 47, I think 48.
47 countries with 49 members.
40, thank you. And what's ironic about this, of course, is that then many of the participating countries in the Bologna process used the excuse of participating in the Bologna process to reform internally their own higher education systems, even where there was no problem with the Bologna process which compelled them to do this. And that in turn led to whole series of reforms across Europe, which had nothing to do really with the Bologna process, but it was used as an excuse, which in turn then produced a student reaction to that. And I've been present at conferences in Europe where there have been protests outside the conferences from students against the Bologna process, when what they were protesting about actually was increasing fees, which has nothing to do with the Bologna process, but does have something to do with some of the trends I described earlier. Now that's just one example of how, in a way, the complexity of the situation we're dealing with now, and especially some of the political complexities, have grown over the last 20 years rather than anything else. Under a situation in which you would think that the forces of globalization might be producing something more homogeneous. Quite the contrary, it's producing these heterogeneous changes. So, if that were not enough, of course, as higher education has got bigger, as it's become massified, if you like, it is higher education institutions, universities, have also become more differentiated from each other. So 25 years ago, most universities looked the same, within reason. I mean, they had different reputations, but it was a smaller system all across Europe, more homogeneous, they look more the same. Today, the spectrum of institutions which call themselves universities is far, far wider. And therefore, a number of things have followed. It is impossible for all universities to cover the complete range of activities which are expected of them at what have to be these days, going back to globalization, global and not just local standards of excellence. I'll give you one example, which is research. Depending on how you count them, there are approximately 17,000 universities worldwide, and there are about 7,500 in Europe. But only 0.1% of them appear in the international league tables, because they're primarily based on research excellence. So there are, we could argue this, but believe me, the generality is true. Out of the 17,000 universities worldwide, there are probably only about 250 or 300 of them, which are serious, internationally competitive players in research, especially scientific research. That indicates the spread. whereas a generation ago it was assumed all universities did research and did it more or less in equal measure. In that situation, universities can't do everything they would like to do. They certainly can't do everything competitively they would want to do. So there's greater segmentation and greater hierarchy. Now, there's some tricky issues there, which as sociologists quite fascinate me. At one level, a greater diversity is a good thing because it allows universities to focus on what they can best deliver to their stakeholders, especially to their students. And we could say that that's a good thing, that diversity should be celebrated, which indeed I believe it should. The problem is that certainly in England, and I think probably in the academic community more generally, we all have a genius for converting diversity into hierarchy. We're a little bit uncomfortable with diversity, but we're actually quite comfortable with hierarchy, hence league tables. And it's very quickly diversity gets translated into hierarchy, and that's because of status. The status and therefore the reputation of universities still rests overwhelmingly on research. I'm not saying it should do, I'm making an empirical observation, it does do. And if you look at the national or international league tables of universities, they overwhelmingly follow hierarchy of research excellence rather than anything else, which is unfortunate. And therefore, what people like me, heads of universities, obsess themselves about is where we should position our university, my university, within this spectrum of 21st century universities. Where do you want to position your university? How are you going to do it? That involves branding, marketing, focus, it involves all sorts of things which we've been rather more familiar from the private sector, but which today we have to give very considerable thought to in universities as well. So market positioning becomes important. There's a set of issues there which I won't go into. You can pick them up in discussion if you wish, which increasingly we get concerned about in universities and which have become really important. So what does all this mean for global higher education? I'm going to sort of draw this to a close and then just end by saying a few words about the current situation in the UK. With a global higher education, for those of you whose English is the first language, my office initially missed out the first H on wither. So it was actually whether higher education was going to wither away rather than which direction it's going in. First one is diversity or hierarchy. This is a really, really important issue. Should higher education policy be directed towards supporting and developing diversity in the higher education system? Or should it actually recognise the necessity of hierarchy, especially in research? In Europe, compared with the United States, should we be actually looking to support a pinnacle of world-class universities in Europe to compete with the world-class universities in the United States? In Europe, maybe we're only talking about 50. Or should we be saying no? In Europe, we should be supporting and celebrating and resourcing a much wider diversity of excellence, not just research excellence. And we should take that on a much broader front across the board. I mean, these are genuine dilemmas which I could believe that the European Commission is dealing with on almost a daily basis. Secondly, if, especially now in the current financial climate, and I have to say this analysis was developed before Lehman Brothers collapsed, but now in the current financial climate, the only hope, frankly, I believe, but again you can challenge me on this, for the continuing expansion of mass higher education at high levels of quality is actually to bring in private resources in some form. The form can vary. It could be private institutions, it could be fees, it could be a greater contribution from stakeholders. The form may vary, but I think to place a long-term bet that politicians for the next 20 or 30 years will privilege the funding of universities from taxation above other claims on taxation, I think is a very long bet. And I keep saying this to my Scandinavian colleagues, especially, who think that what's going on in England is terrible. External control or autonomy, this goes back to the issues I talked about, which you and I involved in earlier. The extent to which governments should be told to back off, that however important universities may be to the national economic and social effort, the empirical evidence appears to suggest that universities perform best when they are most autonomous. That way they have the flexibility to adapt to social and economic change. They have the ability to pursue goals which governments, long-term goals which governments may not understand. But there is a real dilemma there as well. And finally, in all of this, should we or shouldn't we be looking at a real market in higher education? Should higher education be driven not by the supply side, by people like me or you, but actually by the students in particular? Should it be more demand-led? And what the students are looking for should determine the shape and structure of the sector. This has been at the centre of now quite a lengthy debate in the UK. It's not just over the last couple of years, it actually goes back nearly a decade. And it all comes back to that triangle again about how you massify, improve quality and fund higher education all at the same time. There is a recognition in the UK that higher education is both a public and a private good. That's to say there are personal rewards for the students from graduating, but there are also public good rewards from having a highly educated workforce through higher education. What there has not been in the UK is any debate at all about which parts of this should be paid for privately and which parts should be paid for publicly. In other words, if higher education is partly a public good, that is a rationale for public investment. But when you ask the question, so what should the public investment be purchasing? Silence. And yet there are some fairly obvious answers to that question. You should be purchasing welfare, that is to say, allowing talented students from poor backgrounds to participate. It should be purchasing quality, and so on and so on. We can come back to that in discussion. We need appropriate regulation to capture those public benefits. Universities these days can't just walk away and simply ignore their public responsibilities. We need, I would argue, to create a managed marketplace, not a free market, but one that's got market-like forces, competitive forces that promote dynamism and innovation, but which is nevertheless managed to achieve public good aims. And also we need a much clearer sense of public policy goals to drive economic competitiveness and social cohesion. Whoops, beg your pardon. That brings me now to the Brown report. We had an election just a year ago now in the UK, and before the election, the then Labour government announced that it was going to have an inquiry into the future financing of higher education, and it created a panel chaired by Lord Brown, the former Chief Executive of BP, a company you may have heard of recently, to look into this. And I think the driving force was very much that triangle I mentioned earlier. Brown recommended a free market in fees on the grounds that this would propel universities into a more market-based approach and would confer consumer sovereignty, consumer power on the students. Now this was coupled with a whole series of other recommendations to protect students from poor families, which I'll come back to. But the government, which is a coalition government, on the first day that the report was published, announced it was going to cap the fee at £9,000. And because it didn't know what it was doing, it instantly produced a guide price for all universities. It said that the minimum price would have to be £6,000 and the maximum £9,000. It also, by the way, I should have covered this, said it was going to withdraw 80% of government funding for undergraduate teaching. So essentially what it was doing was transferring the cost of higher education, as I've said there in the first point, from the taxpayer to the graduate. Students do not, and they don't now, and they will not in the future, have to pay the fee at the beginning. Instead, they come to university, they don't pay a fee at that time. After they've graduated, if their earnings rise to a certain level, they start repaying a loan which they can take out on the fee and also on a living cost. It's not a straight-line system, really. called contingent loans. And, but unfortunately, the government, by introducing the 9,000 cap, and at the same time taking away the bulk of our teaching funding, because they didn't think it through, came across a number of unintended consequences. Firstly, £9,000 became a guide price, not a cap. Which university was going to charge less than £9,000 and publicly admit it was therefore of lower quality? Secondly, £9,000 was approximately £1,000 more than the cost of the withdrawal of the government teaching funding. And most of that £1,000 was also taken up by other cuts in capital funding. So actually you needed to charge very close to £9,000 just to get your money back. So there's another reason why universities would not charge. And to cut a long story short, what has happened is that nearly everybody is charging £9,000. So one of the purposes of the policy change, which is to introduce a market dynamism into the funding, has not worked, because everybody's charging more or less the same price, and therefore there's no differentiation on price. By the way, also, £9,000 is not quite enough to do something which most vice-chancellors, especially myself, would like to do, which is to guarantee to students from poor backgrounds that they will pay nothing at all, ever. We would like to operate an American-style needs-blind admission system, which students are admitted on their merit. We then look at their financial circumstances and give them scholarships which guarantee that they won't have to pay if their circumstances demand it. What we are doing, and all other universities are doing, is indeed introducing more bursaries, but we can't quite introduce a needs-blind admission system, which is very unfortunate. Another recommendation of Brown was that the government should in future specify the total numbers, the macro numbers entering the higher education system, because it had to control public expenditure. Back to the triangle again. It would control the macro numbers entering the sector, but within those total numbers, each individual university would be free to recruit as many students as they wished. That's a contrast with the current system where all universities are given a quota of student numbers, each one by one. Now this, of course, would introduce a big dynamic into the system, because it becomes a zero-sum game. If I can attract more high-quality students to Liverpool, somebody somewhere else has got fewer. And when the music stops, it probably would mean that some universities would disappear. As I said there, the government response is still awaited on this. They, for 1 year, they kept the quotas in place, the individual quotas, and we're waiting to see how they're going to respond to that. Because the fee is not producing any dynamic. The dynamic in the system will come from student numbers moving around, and at the moment that's not been decided upon. And then finally, this is very important, there are obligations to support poor students. All universities have to submit to, essentially to the government, a draft agreement which demonstrates how we are going to give scholarships and bursaries to poor students. And we cannot charge a £9,000 fee unless and until that has been agreed. It's not quite by the government, it's by the funding council, but essentially by the government. So that's where we are. Now, finally, I think you can see from this, even in this little case study at the end of the UK, which I know all over Europe, everybody is watching the UK to see what happens. It does come back again to that triangle and that rectangle. How do you reconcile the conflicting public policy goals of a modern higher education system? It is fascinating in this regard to look at China. We have a campus in China, we go to China quite often. In China, for example, there is an absolutely unstoppable social demand for higher education. Forget the economics of this. Every 17-year-old, who's usually a one-child family, from one child, wants to go to university, and there's no way in which the Chinese government can accommodate that demand from taxation. So even in China, first of all, they've introduced fees. Not many people realise this in Europe. and certainly the national universities, and of course there is now a flourishing private sector in China as well, the Minban. So even in a communist state, although of course it is the most capitalist country in the world, but nevertheless in a communist state, you find these forces at play. And I think we're going to see this all across Europe over the next decade or so. And I think to see how it's going to work out locally in each country in terms of the political forces determining the direction. Because at the end of the day, universities are important to society, they are important to the economy. Every country needs some at least globally competitive universities, and they have to be funded and resourced adequately. This, I think, is the dilemma for the next decade. So, I'm sorry I've gone on a little longer.
I just wondered what you thought the relation was between the universities actually adapting themselves to the new situation in the world, globalization and all the rest of it, and the role of government and government interference. You sometimes represented it as if you thought the pressure was from government, as it were, for the universities to do the right thing. Towards the end, you suggested that, in fact, autonomy of the universities, they do a lot better. Do you think, for example, producing the kind of students that are needed in the economy as a whole, in the broadest sense, or getting the right kind of quality out of students, is really advanced by the heavy bureaucratic quality game that's developed in the last 25 years? Or do you think that the budget problem is a real one, but so long as the universities get their money from somewhere, the competition between them is enough, the needs to turn out students that are wanted by industry and all the rest of it is enough? Anyway, industry doesn't care often what a student has done in his degree. They're quite happy for people to come from English and history and philosophy and be educated. So has the actual government interference been a positive part of the readaptation, or has it been a really rather misery-producing interference? The universities could have kept quite well themselves.
My personal view is that, and again I'm drawing from British experience, how to reconcile this is there needs to be more planning at the strategic level of higher education systems, more strategic planning, but less micromanagement. So a phrase I've actually borrowed from somebody else, but I've often used it, is in the written version of the paper. I would argue that the British system is under-planned, but over-regulated. And I'm saying that, I didn't have time to go through all this in the presentation, but planning and regulation are not the same thing. And I think to sort of just tease out the differences there and explore some of that, I think is quite interesting, as a means of reconciling that triangle and the rectangle. Actually, if you like, it helps the discussion, I think.
Thank you for your lecture. I learned a lot. Actually, I am interested in the diversity of the institutions in my research activity. And that's right, I would like to ask you something. What do you think on the activity of mapping in Europe? Contra ranking. I try to understand the philosophy and of this activity, and I try to try mapping Hungarian university system and to show is it working or not. But my problem is the contradiction, you know. Mapping is something, no hierarchy, definitely, yeah? But suddenly, this is a hierarchy.
Yes, exactly. Well, that's again a very interesting question. There has been a lot of interest at the European Commission in ranking European universities, and this began actually under the French presidency, under Sarkozy, who has lost patience with the French universities. Just as in an earlier period, the Japanese Prime Minister Koizumi lost patience with the Japanese universities and reformed them. And he's lost patience with them because he thinks they are too conservative, too slow to adapt, they're not innovating, they're not competitive even within Europe. And so during his presidency, he essentially instructed the Commission to develop a ranking for European universities. A ranking, not a And indeed, pilot studies have been taking place to look at this, and I'm on the advisory committee for that. They're being undertaken by a team that's mostly drawn from the University of Twente in the Netherlands and from Cologne in Germany, from chaps. And we're due to report in July, or they are due to report in July. What's been interesting as this project, it's called U Multi-Rank, and it's an attempt to produce a multi-dimensional description of universities in Europe. It's a feasibility study only at this stage, and what's been interesting as time has gone on is it's become very clear to everybody, apart from politicians, that you cannot produce a valid ranking of European universities because of this diversity issue. What you can produce is information, is data on the various dimensions. The quality of research, the quality of learning and teaching, the quality of knowledge transfer, the employability of students, the contribution to regional development, etc., etc. I say you can produce data on that. In fact, a lot of member states don't have it, but that's another issue. And you can put that onto a website, and you can produce an analytical tool. This is what's interesting about this project, about U Multi-Rank, which says, no, there's no such thing. There is no such thing as an objective ranking. That will probably be the first sentence of their report. But what you can do is say, here's this data, and to the user, you produce a ranking, if you wish to, based upon what's important to you. And it's quite interesting. I think it's quite an elegant solution to a genuine difficulty. I mean, we all know that rankings are not very valid, not very reliable, especially international ones. But there is a demand for them. There is a demand for them from students, especially the internationally mobile students. There's demand certainly from newspapers. They're not going to go away. They're not going to. They sell newspapers, they sell magazines. So this is a rather elegant, it's trying to democratize the process of ranking. It's saying, here's the information, you as a consumer, you can draw your own conclusions from this. And I think there's something quite attractive actually about that. But we have to recognise in the academic community that the problem is partly one of our own making. As I said in my talk, we, if we're honest, are a little uncomfortable with diversity. We shouldn't be. We shouldn't be. So what's going on here is actually a ranking of reputation and status as much as performance, very often. And you can see that in the Shanghai Jiaotong Index, and most of the international rankings especially. They may not be very reliable or very valid rankings, but they are very influential. When people say to me sometimes, oh, you know, you've got these world-class, they take the Shanghai Jiaotong Index, and they say, oh, you know, in the UK you've got 6 world-class universities out of the top 50. And I say, yes, but we've also got probably another 15 or 20, which you will never have heard about, which are just as world-class. And they are places like the Royal College of Music, the Royal Academy of Dramatic Art. These are specialist institutions which are undoubtedly world-class, but you do not see in any ranking because the criteria for selection in the rankings does not include them. And I'm sure if you produced an international ranking of music conservatoires, for example, Hungary would feature very strongly, Kodai and so on. But of course it doesn't appear in Shanghai Jiaotong Index because they're not measuring that kind of thing. So I agree with you. I think we should be celebrating diversity, but the reality is that we're dealing in hierarchy. And as academics, we're all snobs, really. We all go around and say, well, because my university is better than your university.
Anna?
Yeah, speaking of internal contradictions, I was thinking a bit about this tension between the poles of massification and reduction in the fiscal burden. But still, and in your talk as well, and today when we talk about differences between education as public and private good, and private and public returns to education, we seem to think of the world in which a minority, and a very significant minority of the population was highly educated. But if massification continues at the rate at which it's going right now, at some point it's going to be at least half of the population, which means at least half of the taxpayers.
It's already 85% in Finland.
Exactly. So why are we then basically the difference between public and private investment in education decreases significantly? Thus, if you would just care to comment on that, because I think that the economic debate is still phrased in the terms that are adapted to a very elite conception of higher education, whereas so that's, I think it's a sort of a bit of a false dichotomy, or at least will become a false dichotomy sooner rather than later.
Well, I think there are two answers to that question. One is a rather cynical, and I'm saying this really as a joke. I think we can deal with that problem when we get to it. You're right, of course, logically, you're absolutely right. There is a ceiling effect. There are no more percents than 100. So there becomes a ceiling effect. I just wish in the UK we were in a position where we had to worry about that rather than worrying about, no, I'm serious about how to get more than 45% into the system. But that's a rather sort of, that's not a serious response to your question. I think the serious response is that, of course, while this is going on, the structure of the economy is also changing. So the massification hasn't just occurred because more students want to go to university. It's occurred and because the structure of the economy is demanding more graduate level skills. And that is why, at least in the UK, although it's gone from 7% to 45% in the period of about 40 years, the rate of return to graduates has not gone down. It's not gone down because the demands of the economy are still such that it places a premium price on graduate skills. Now, we then come back to the first part of my response, which is how long that can be sustained. Well, it is, of course, logically possible that in a global economy we could have 100% of the population as graduates because the nature of the local economy, the UK economy in this case, is such that its entire output contributing to the global economy is based on graduate level skills. Now, I don't believe that for a moment, but I'm just saying that I think that the answer to your question is it's not just the supply side, it's also the demand side. And it gets more complicated in the global economy because you're dealing with global divisions of labour and global flows of students as well.
But speaking of Hungary, and this may be a kind of counter-argument to what Jana just said. Hungary has one of the lowest enrollment rates in Europe, and our colleagues who know more about it. I think it's in the range of 30% or something like that. So it's towards the end of the scale. There are other countries which are even lower. And what is also interesting, Hungary basically has no private universities. We are the only real private university in Hungary. There are some, other institutions, not necessarily universities, providing private education. Is it because of that there's this low level of enrollment? I don't know. But the enrollment rate is very low as yet, and there's no guarantee that it will increase to reach 100% anytime soon. So I will not take this for granted. Not to go back to the discussion about which is not an official position, whether Hungary needs more universities or less universities, more students or less students, and there are other countries where this discussion is taking place. But just to make justice to Hungary, low enrollment doesn't mean low quality necessarily. There are countries with higher enrollment, a huge number of private universities, like my own country, Romania, where the quality is not there in the private sector at all. So that is not necessarily an answer. Yes?
Can I go back to your reply on diversification and diversity, which I think in a way you evaded the real issue. It's not that Royal Manchester College of Music or the great art colleges are not ranked. Diversification is collected, as I usually think, with massification. There are lots of institutions that are no longer trying to be intellectually elite, but are degree-giving bodies doing an educational job. Edge Hill University and Chester University, as well as Liverpool University. And when you talk about diversification rather than elitism, isn't the question of the kind of emphasis that should be given to them as against Oxford and Liverpool? and what kind of status these other places that are not doing diverse skills like the arts or the drama or music, but are where the great mass of the massification is taken up. Maybe the increase of the number of places that used to be ordinary colleges, teacher training colleges, technical colleges, that are now technically universities, and how they're going to be ranked, and how you compare them and what kind of job they're supposed to be doing compared with the 30 original universities, that kind of issue.
I've taught in a new university, I haven't taught in one. I've been Vice-Chancellor of a new university as well as older universities like Liverpool and Southampton. And I can assure you that in many cases, the quality of the teaching is pretty indistinguishable, as it should be, even though the talent range of the students is different, and in some cases, but not all, the learning outcomes are different. So I don't think we need to get into the kind of thing you described. The fact of the matter is that some of the trends you described about massification is because the labour market has demanded higher level skills of professions which until quite recently were not considered to be, it wasn't considered necessary to go into higher education. So whether it's accountancy or nursing or librarianship, and that's pretty much a global phenomenon. Indeed, teacher training, as you yourself said. So some of the massification is of that kind, but a lot of it is because the economy is simply demanding high-level skills. If you're a plumber these days, you actually have to learn an awful lot about materials and metallurgy. Just as if you're a medical student, I still hope you need certain vocational skills. I mean, when I go into hospital next time, I'm going to be well looked after, as opposed to an intellectual understanding of DNA. Now, the point I'm trying to make is that I think that when you're dealing with these high-level skills, there's actually quite a lot of convergence going on. But if you like the top, and now this is a very, I apologise to the rest of you, this is a very British, in fact English debate now. But anyway, when you're looking at post-16 education, the top end of what we call further education, which is, if you like, vocational training, is converging quite rapidly with what I'll call, for want of a better term, vocational higher education. There isn't a lot of difference between them, but that's not being recognised in public policy. My own view is it ought to be, and one of these reconciliations is to come to terms with that fact, and then look at how post-16 education across the board can be restructured in such a way, again, that not all institutions are being asked to do everything. We're a long, long, long way from that. And I'm sorry, this is a very kind of, probably a very British kind of fact. If you take California, which is not actually a system I particularly like because it is so hierarchical, but it's certainly clear. I mean, the community colleges deal with the vocational training, the state universities deal with what I just called vocational higher education, and the University of California system deals with what we might call research-led teaching. The difficulties, you probably all know, is that the myth of California is rather different to the reality. There's actually very little mobility between the three layers. First of all, only 25% of the students in the community colleges actually graduate. And so it goes on. Now, because I work there, a system I'm more familiar with and like a lot more is actually the Wisconsin system, where it's not so hierarchical, and where a set of campuses around the state plug into a research-intensive campus, the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And that goes back to one of the points I was making earlier to you in here, that one reconciliation is a bit more strategic, emphasize strategic planning over universities, rather than, not micromanagement, strategic planning to begin to understand how one can reconcile some of these, I was going to say competing public policy goals. They shouldn't be competing, but in reality they sort of look as though they're competing. The rest we can talk about over a beer.
Well, Howard, thank you so much. It was very interesting, informative. You may get emails with questions, either from our own colleagues or from journalists or who knows, once we put this up. Thank you very much.
I should thank you.